everyone, welcome to a new edition of Hue at Home. And this one will be very interesting because it's a subject matter that I do not know a lot about. But if you're like me, I truly want to learn more. And so we're going to take a deep dive into history, but the history in the church, and specifically with women. So my very special guest is Caryn Douglas. Welcome to Hue at Home, Caryn.
Thank you.
And just to preface our relationship, I was working on a fundraiser for something that you were volunteering for. And like always, we get into a conversation, and you were telling me on the work that you were doing as a researcher, but more importantly, your, I guess, relationship with the church for such a long, long time. And I find it so fascinating. So I'm going to start with the question, Caryn. Tell us a little bit about your background and your passion for the church.
Okay, thank you. I really appreciate this opportunity. I love to talk about this stuff. So in the United Church tradition, which I am part of, I am a diaconal minister, from the word deacon, which most people will recognize. And in our denomination, that tradition is rooted in a ministry of deaconesses, a ministry that was specific to women. And when I started to develop my identity as a diaconal minister in the 80s, when I was in formation, I just began to appreciate how important the rootedness in the ministry those women did. So in the United Church, starting in 1895 with the Methodist tradition, which is part of the history of the United Church, women could become deaconesses in Canada. And between 1895 and 1977, when there's a bit of a change in how we view things, there were about 700 women who served the church. And their story is often rendered invisible for a lot of reasons. And I just wanted to make their stories known, and I've dedicated a lot of my time and my academic work to telling the story of these women.
So what kind of work would they do, Caryn?
Yeah, so of course it evolved over the period of time. But initially, both Methodist and Presbyterian deaconesses largely did social work, and before there was, social work was a profession. It was developing along the same time, the idea of an official social worker, but they did social work in inner city settings and mission work, both within Canada and in other parts of the world. But that evolved so that they started to do educational work as well, with children particularly, or with women. Mm-hmm. And then eventually, because the church's core needs always rise to prominence, they were recruited to fill pulpits when there was a shortage of people. So the church in the United Church tradition officially welcomed women into ordination in 1926. The first woman was ordained 10 years later. But it wasn't until the 1970s that women were really in the church in large numbers as ordained women in leading worship and in working in congregations. But these deaconesses did a lot of the work that a minister would do early on, without, of course, the pay, and often not the same recognition.
Oh, well, let's talk about the recognition. When they took on these positions, did they have to forfeit other positions or relationships?
Sure. So a big piece of the history is that the women, when they became deaconesses, when they became members of the order, had to leave for a couple of reasons. The main one being if they got married. And of course, given a choice of a poor-paying vocation in the church and an opportunity to be married, most women chose marriage. Although there are stories of women who declined marriage because their conviction to serving the church was so core to who they were, they decided they would remain as deaconesses. So it painted the order as a temporary, kind of frivolous thing that is something you would do until your real vocation of wife and mother came along. In fact, that's how the church advertised. Is there a young woman in your congregation who is not yet married, who might serve the church for a few years? And then this is like just the classic. And who knows, the church might get 2 workers for the price of 1, because well over 150 of those 700 women married ordained men and became clergy wives, trained volunteers, expected to work alongside their partners in the work that they were doing. So, but the reality is, half of the women who went into diaconal ministry did not, as deaconesses, did not marry. So then there were sort of these 2 views. It was something for young, fleeting, or it was spinsters who were dried up and had nothing better to do in life, and so would continue as serving the church. And that's the big picture. I think, though, for most deaconesses who remained in the order for their entire careers, the relationships they built with people were solid, and the people they served in their outreach or their congregations, they knew they weren't dried up has-beens. I mean, they knew they were vital, creative, and doing important ministry. But it goes with how we view women, right?
Oh my goodness, like this is so amazing, and yet they are probably responsible for encouraging and gaining more members, right, coming to church to spread the word.
Yes, so they did do a good job at being on the fringes. So in the women who served, like in Winnipeg, in the North End, there was All People's Mission, which was a really large enterprise, mostly to Ukrainian immigrants, right, at the time. Like I'm talking pre-First World War and into the 20s. And they were working with the poorest of poor in the city, and some of the motivation was recruitment, and we have to know that we have to look at what they did in the context of their time. Really colonial in their attitudes, very little awareness about how they were stomping on Indigenous peoples' traditions. That just was not the character of the time. So now we would be critical of that approach. But it's important in history to see history from its context. And so for the time, their work in some ways was quite progressive, because they were willing to go places people didn't want to go. And in terms of others who worked in what was called missionary at large, they would go to the furthest edges of civilization, little towns in northern Saskatchewan, often on bicycle or with a horse-drawn sleigh to get around from congregation to congregation. And basically, they went where no man was going to go, right? Because there were other choices. Men didn't have to go there, and so they took the gospel with them to the edges.
When you learn about all of these different stories, Caryn, and you apply it to your own work, what kind of effect has it had on you?
Yeah, so as I said earlier, from the moment I discovered the stories of these women, I felt really connected to them. So I've spent years and years and years doing the research, pulling together stories and photographs. When I open up a file, I feel like I'm opening a family album. I feel this really direct connection. And I think especially around the disjoining, that's what it was called when women had to leave, the church apologized to those women in 2006 officially. And it was in some ways important and done with sincerity, but not entirely it was not entirely a good thing the way the church enacted the apology or followed up with action. And so I've learned from those women and through that experience about how important it is to acknowledge our history and take responsibility for our history. And that has so many parallels in so many other pieces of how we are in the world these days. So, those women inspire me and keep me going some days, I think.
Well, what did you say the number was? 700 women?
Yes.
Are there that many women involved in the church today?
Well, interestingly, the church, starting actually in the early part of the 1900s, the church has been losing men. Maybe religion has always been something that women flock to more because of its emotive and spiritual kind of aspects, even though women weren't in leadership. Nellie McClung in 1915 in her book writes about the feminization of the church. So in these days, as the church has declined in importance in culture, men have left it, and they've left the leadership. So in many denominations, women now dominate in terms of church leadership because we're small and fractured. It's still true that in many denominations, well, in the Roman Church, of course, there's very few women in leadership, that kind of leadership. But in many denominations, men still hold the prestigious places. But the United Church, maybe for lots of reasons, we have a pretty good balance of women in significant positions of authority. That does not mean we've overcome sexism at all, but
that's
it's
another
interesting.
topic.
Yes, it's interesting to see how women are in leadership, and then what women do with that leadership, is
And
is
that's
our challenge.
always, yeah. And even if you take a look at the history now, and you had mentioned these women would go where no man would go, and thinking about the relationships that they started, it is the beginnings of social work. Do you see the church, religion becoming part of social work today?
So the church is so diverse, right? And so we've been hearing in the media this last couple of weeks about the Roman Church and the apology to Indigenous people. And, that's one way that the church is manifest. But there are other expressions. And when you get down to, in many, many, many Christian communities, service in the world is really an important aspect of who they are. It may be a minority of the individuals within the body of that community who actually carry it out. But the sentiment to be of service to the world is very strong. And you just have to read, the whole Bible, but especially parts of the New Testament, which Christians, of course, uphold, to be motivated to that. You cannot ignore it. The gospel message is so strongly about looking out for your neighbor, serving each other, loving God, loving your neighbor. They go hand in hand. And so many churches really are doing a good job at that. Unfortunately, as the church declines and ages, it's harder to keep that going, and then you kind of fold in on yourself. And once you start looking only inward, you're dead as a Christian community, because you'll just die. So
and we don't want that.
No, and the church is, I think the church has a really important message to be delivering right now. For one thing, we have a responsibility to have a reformed view of colonialism. Like the church provided the theology that undergirded colonialism. And we have to provide a different theology now, because, like the Pope was saying, we need a new way of a new doctrine that replaces the doctrine of discovery. We need a new doctrine about how we are in relationship with one another. So, and the church also has a strong message about empathy and community, and we feel like that's strained in our culture in Canada.
Oh, it certainly is. So, Caryn, you are going to come back because, yes, I want to know your opinions on the Pope's visit.
Okay.
Talk more about truth and reconciliation, the work that was done by these deaconesses, and how in the future we can get more people, and not necessarily, definitely more women, but of all genders, right? We now have to be thinking more outside the box. So, don't go away. Caryn will be back and will be engaged in some more conversation. But right now, we'll have a profile on a newcomer who have found her passion through art with Artbeat Studios. You're watching Hue at Home.
what, say what, say what. Girl, you know what's up. Ooh, say what, say what, say what. So tell me what's up. Tell me what's up. I'm digging you. I'm feeling you. Girl, you know what's up. Said I'm digging you. And I'm wanting you. So tell me what's up. Tell me what's up. Girl, you know what's up. Ooh, say what, say what, say what. Girl, you know what's up.
I grew up in Ukraine and I lived in Israel for many years, and I moved to Canada and I felt like I lost so many things on the way, and my inspiration wasn't even there. It was just working, and all my energy was going into things like that and raising my kids, and I was not thinking about coming back to becoming an artist as I was. And it was an accident that I met a wonderful person, Lori Green. She passed away years ago, but I'm grateful so much for everything she did for me. She introduced me to Studio Central, 2011, I believe. I started attending Studio Central and my functioning was improving from the workshops I was attending, getting some routine. After my 4 hospitalizations, it was the place I could actually function at. The shifts at Studio Central are 2 hours for everyone, unless you want to pick up more. And I think that's a great opportunity and possibility for people who suffer and recover from mental health conditions. But also it's perfect for mentally absolutely healthy people who know how art heals and how it gives your heart some kind of a destination, something to go to follow your heart. If you're a little bit lost, or if you know for sure what you want, that's the place you want to go to.
Welcome back to Hue at Home. My special guest is Caryn Douglas. And Caryn, I should be calling you Dr. Caryn Douglas, or perhaps Reverend.
Yes, well, I'll accept the doctor title because I earned that. But I don't like to be called Reverend. It's not a tradition coming out of the deaconess movement. They didn't assume that title. But I'm not comfortable with it because it means revered, and I don't feel all that special. and I think that's I think it points to a new way that we have to be in the world, actually, because we see ourselves as humanity above the rest of creation. You know, we take that Genesis story and really milk it in ways that we could interpret it differently, but we don't. We have dominion over the world. And as Christians, we have said we are superior, to other faith traditions, indigenous, Muslim, almost every faith tradition. We are to be revered for who we are. And we just have to let go of that. It's part of the colonial perspective, and it's not been very helpful. So as I was saying earlier, these deaconesses did terrific work, but blind to things. So there was a movement of deaconesses in United Church tradition who did mission to the Ukrainians. There was some of that in the city of Winnipeg, but out in rural Alberta and rural Manitoba. And their goal was to convert those people to Christianity. So even though these folks were Eastern Rite Christians, that didn't count, So sometimes when we look back like that, we can laugh and say, how ridiculous, how could they not have seen that? And then, but then we need to say, so what are we not seeing? Where are our blinders about things we assume are necessary or are right? And we have to be critical thinkers,
So we were talking to you about the Pope's recent visit to Canada, truth and reconciliation, the residential schools. We've been inundated, in the last year and a half or so, and it's horrifying. And he said, yes, we have to change the doctrine. Where do you begin to change, and how long will that take? And will you change the minds of thousands?
So 3 things. One, it has started to change. So I think there's reason to be hopeful. And I just hearken to the words of Marie Sinclair, who was the commissioner, one of the, the lead commissioner with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He said, it took us all these generations to get here. It's going to take us that many generations to get out. And I think there's a lot of wisdom. That's not an excuse for not taking action, but it takes a long time to undo things. But I think it starts with small things, like it's not really small, but like the apology. It's iconic, right? If it stops there, it won't mean anything.
Yeah.
But if people open their eyes and say, gee, must be something here to think about, then there's room for shifting. Look how much we changed through COVID, right? Change is certainly possible if we're motivated to do it. So it's structuring the motivation. So in some ways, paying reparations is motivation. And so that's one reason why they were built in. And let's hope the Roman Church now, after the apology, will follow through and pay their share of the reparations, which have not been paid. The other denominations have paid their shares. Not that makes us better, but at least we have been compliant with the expectations.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When you're presenting to your church, do you kind of want to now pose those questions to them, to make them think, to make maybe a different decision than they would have normally?
Certainly for my work, I work at the United Church in Meadowood here in Winnipeg, and you come on any given Sunday, you're probably going to hear me talk about something related to that, because it's a priority the United Church has established for ourselves, is to work on reconciliation. And so I'm trying to bring it as a lens to almost everything we do. And I think that would be true in a number of other in the United Church in general, and other denominations like the Anglican Church and the Presbyterians, who are also involved in the residential schools. I'm not so familiar with what's happening in Roman churches. And you said something about, for a few years we've been aware. But in 1976, the Saskatchewan Conference in the United Church had a year of repentance in recognition of not so much focused on residential schools, but around what had happened with Indigenous people in the church. So we've been working on this stuff for a long time already, or at least from our lifetime feels like a long time.
Yeah.
But things are growing. So for myself, I worked in an Indigenous community in 1983. I was minister there for 3 years. And when I look at what is different for that community now, however, nearly 40 years later, it just is astounding. I'm sure for many people who are still struggling with the trauma of intergenerational abuse, et cetera, it's hard. It can be hard to see that, but amazing things have happened, and amazing things have happened in the church as well. So there are things happening. But yes, I'm sure some people are tired of listening to me, but they're the ones who need to hear, right?
Yes,
so
I know.
I'm not going to stop doing it.
So there you go. Yes.
Yeah.
So now let's switch it a bit to the future. and getting more women, young women. Maybe not the campaign that they did way
right.
back then for a deaconess. No, so don't worry, girls. We won't be doing that. But what kind of, I guess, offerings are there now? Opportunities?
Yes. So, we're in such interesting times. Maybe every time is an interesting time, but and it's hard to know what will attract a new generation to Christianity. There's some denominations which have success with a kind of I don't know, like a upbeat sort of, but lots of theorists say it's an attraction to the shell, maybe not the core message, and how long people will stick to that remains to be seen. But the church Christendom, that idea that the church is the nation, is dying. In lots of places it's dead. So what will emerge maybe will be more authentic. It may be smaller. It will be smaller, at least in our context. It may be less institutional and more of a movement. And that's what deaconesses were about in a way. They worked on the edges where the institution wasn't so strong, and it was more a gathering, people coming together. It gives us a chance to abandon things which were baggage and go back to what's core. Love your neighbor, love yourself, follow in Jesus' way, which was about calling out the powerful, raising up those who are least empowered, befriending the lepers. That would be like a street person today, whatever. So those messages have appeal. And women maybe have, and we need to even stop thinking about men and women, right? Like that's the whole new challenge. I'm on with that, but I struggle to integrate that into my thinking, because that dichotomy framework of male female is so inbred into who I am. So we start to think about God as they, which actually has its roots in Old Testament scripture. So that's not a new idea, but we didn't pay attention to it before because it didn't make sense to us. Now we're reclaiming that. God, created in my image, men and women. They, it's not like God's a male or a female, right? So there's lots of possibility as we think about it. Dizzying to think about it, and then, so we have to let go of the things which we counted on, like public recognition, money from, that would keep a building going and keep a staff in place, and think about being the church in new ways, on the streets, on the edges, caring for each other. And young people will find that interesting, I think, but how do we communicate that? That's a big challenge.
Well, that always is. But for yourself, though, I guess, doing all this research, all of the years that you've been with the church, how has it kind of fulfilled you, Caryn?
Yes, well, most days I'm appreciative. It's always that when you work for an institution that you also have your faith rooted in, that can be really difficult. But the church has given me an amazing amount of support to try things, to be places, to do things, to express myself, to be part of community, to have people tell you the intimate parts of their story because they trust you. And that's not just because I'm in ministry, but I think that's something that happens within Christian community when people build that bond. Those are real gifts. And there's something about, like, Jesus was an important character. And I'm not saying he's more important than any other faith traditions, they're the people that they follow. But he had something to say. Is it better than Nelson Mandela or, other people who are very Christ-like in their proclamations? Well, maybe not. But we have the power of this tradition. We have these stories that we have to go back to every week. We have to read them. And they tell us, love your neighbor, love yourself, love God. So when we want to get ourselves down a bad path, all about me, the stories are there that say, no. You have to look at your neighbor. And I think, that's been a gift for me. It's a struggle. You have to live with that, but what a enrichment for my life. So, I'm an evangelist, I guess, for faith more than even church, because I think it can be it can be a root when you're feeling kind of rootless. So.
Wow. So it has been so wonderful. I guess my last question, all these stories that you're collecting, is it going to be a book, or where can the general public, where can we get these stories?
Sure. So I am in the process of documenting the lives of as many of those women as I can. I keep getting distracted on things. But I have actually written about 80 biographies. And I have a whole bunch more in process. And I keep saying when I retire, which my gray hair, you can tell, isn't going to be too many more years into the future, I'm going to go back to that project. So I have a website.
Oh, and that is?
uccdeaconesshistory.ca. And you can explore that. And I hope one day, I have produced a couple of small resources, and some videos and things there on that website as well. And one day I may produce a book.
I think you should.
Yeah, we'll see.
Yes.
But my website's the big thing where I've been working. And
okay.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Caryn, for spending this time and sharing your wisdom, but also the information. And, I think for all of us, we're all on this journey of hope, but also of repairing, and I think conversation is the first start, and you are so right. So thank you so much, Caryn.
Thank you.
All right, so special thank you to all of our guests on today's show, and as always, stay healthy and safe. And we'll see you next time on Hue at Home.